It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event, a distinguished individual who plays a pivotal role in shaping the future of aerospace and defense technology. Please join me in welcoming Gabe Mounce, Director of the Tech Engagement Office for the Air Force Research Lab in New Mexico. If you're unfamiliar, in his remarkable role, Gabe masterfully oversees the crucial aspects of technology transfer, communication engagement, outreach, marketing, and publicity, specifically focusing on the lab's innovative space and laser technology areas. His expertise and leadership in these domains has been instrumental in advancing groundbreaking technologies that are essential to our national security and space exploration efforts. And Gabe, your contributions extend beyond your role at the Air Force Research Lab. He's also a visionary founder and strategic advisor of SpaceWorks, the U.S. Space Force's Innovation Office. Here, he spearheads initiatives aimed at discovering and integrating private sector capabilities into the Space Force mission, fostering a dynamic synergy between military objectives and civilian technological advancements. Furthermore, Gabe serves our nation with distinction as a colonel in the Air Force Reserve. His assignment to the Combined Force Space Component Command as Chief of Staff under U.S. Spacecom is a testament to his unwavering dedication and strategic acumen in the realm of space defense. His unique blend of technical expertise, strategic insight, and leadership in both public and private sectors position him as a luminary in the field. His insights today are not just reflections of his past experience, but also a beacon guiding us toward a future where space technology and defense strategies evolve hand in hand. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Colonel Gabe Mounce.
Thanks, Garrett. Appreciate it. And just one more mic check with you. Okay for you, Garrett, on your end, I assume?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Thanks to Dana and the Arrowhead team for inviting me to speak today. As Dana said, I as well regret not being able to be with you in person as we've had to go to this virtual format, but thank you so much for joining us today for the SBIR Summit. I'm a big fan of the Arrowhead Center and the work that they do to help companies in New Mexico and I assume in the Southwest region as well, as they look towards the SBIR and the STTR program that the federal government runs in order to enable small businesses to increase their business acumen and their traction in the market, as well as helping them find customers like us at the Department of the Air Force, you know, to make some traction with the federal government, with the Department of Defense in our case. So appreciate the Arrowhead team and all they do for the state, for basically the Southwest region and helping companies and the small business community and grow the industrial base, because that's exactly what we care about on the federal government side. So I think I know I was trying to peruse the attendees here virtually. It's a little bit harder to see everybody's happy faces this morning. This cool wintry morning here in Albuquerque, at least. Also, I'm assuming there's attendance from across the country, so welcome to you guys. I wanted to kind of share with you my perspective, at least in part, having worked in our technology transfer outfit, essentially, for the Air Force Research Lab and the Department of the Air Force, especially when it comes to the growing space economy. I know many of you online probably have heard me talk about this. It's one of the platforms I talk about a lot, just because I'm passionate about it. And I've also very fortunately been given a front row seat into how this economy is growing and how the space sector for the US, the space sector internationally, the commercial space sector is really growing. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides then to help me kind of wade through this talk here. So let me see if I can do that real quick. Bear with me as I do the technology elements here to start us off with that. And I'll wait for it to catch up. Let me take a little bit of time. Not too many slides, but I like the visuals because they help out, I think, tell some of the story here. All Here we go. It's coming. I think my bandwidth is broad enough here. So I am a member of the Air Force Research Lab, a civil servant, as Garrett said at the top here in my introduction. Basically, the Air Force Research Lab is the Department of the Air Force's service lab. We are the S&T, the Science and Technology Organization, doing all of the research and development for the Department of the Air Force. And you might have heard us in the Air Force or the Air Force Research Lab or other places talk about the Department of the Air Force quite a lot, because what we mean by that now is we support both the US Air Force, which most everybody knows about, but we also support the new service, the United States Space Force, which is about 4 years old right now. So we in the Air Force Research Lab, we are the research lab for both services. We support both services under the Department of the Air Force. And the tagline that you might hear the commander of the Air Force Research Lab and other leaders talk about it is that it's one lab supporting two services. If you aren't familiar with the research lab, generically, we are a federal lab that is nationally, geographically distributed across the country. And so this gives you kind of the basis of where we exist, where components of the research lab exist. We divide the research lab into elements that I'll call tech centers that have locations across the country. And I'm not showing all of the locations either. We have some satellite offices in other areas of the country as well that's not on this map. But I work for the part of the research lab that you can see there in Albuquerque at Kirtland Air Force Base. The two technology centers for the research lab at Albuquerque there in Albuquerque support two different kind of functions that the Department of the Air Force cares about. One of those is focused on a technology area we call directed energy. That component is mainly looking at the research and development of technology related to lasers and high power microwaves and that kind of technology. The other element of the Air Force Research Lab that's here in New Mexico is space vehicles. And that's the component I support mainly through my efforts in the space economy. Having said that, let me give you just a quick view of the space side of the house. We have a portfolio of projects that we're doing that I consider to be internal science and technology development within the lab. And in some cases, this technology development does include private sector elements where private sector entities are supporting the researchers in the lab. And in some cases, because this is a SBIR Summit, in some cases, the researchers performing that internal science and technology development are using commercial entities through the SBIR or STTR contracting mechanism to create more research within their portfolios. But generically speaking, we have a spectrum of technology development efforts that range from advanced navigation technology that might be used in future future constellations like the GPS constellation. If you didn't know, the GPS constellation is executed, is operated by the US Space Force now, previously under the US Air Force. And so obviously advancements, we're always looking for advancements in that technology. But all the way to the far lower right-hand corner of this graphic, you can see something we call space domain awareness. I'll touch on this in a little bit as to why this is so important, but really trying to work on advancing technology and capability for how we sense what's happening in the space domain. As you can imagine, it's a gigantic domain, so there's a lot of need for keeping aware of what's happening in that domain. And then some of the what I consider the most current technology area, the most current capability area that the Space Force is exploring, and thereby the research lab is exploring, is what we call space logistics and advanced robotics, having to do with how do you do things now in space between, for instance, one satellite to another, things that we know are coming down the pipeline from a technology development standpoint in the commercial sector, but also one that we are trying to make sure we're on the leading edge of. My office actually supports both of those technology centers that I just mentioned. And what our office is really chartered with doing, as you heard sort of in my introduction, we really are the technology transfer and transition office for the Air Force Research Lab component here in New Mexico. The family of programs we run, we sort of bend them into these 4 categories. A large part of it is our, what I call traditional core technology transfer and transition. And we're the government, so we like to use acronyms. We oftentimes shorten that to be T3 is what we call it. And then we also have other programs that help us build the industrial base in a sense from a workforce development standpoint. So we have a pretty large STEM program, STEM outreach program, K through 12, as well as some other workforce development programs that include internships with the research lab here in New Mexico. And finally, with a larger, starting to be a larger engagement opportunity for university outreach. But ultimately, we are responsible for fostering relationships and partnerships with the private sector, which includes industry, the academic sector, other private sector elements, and even other government entities. And the whole point of that is so that we can ultimately engage in this technology transfer and transition. So for us, in that terminology, transfer and transition, actually means some specific things. The transfer part is that we in the lab, and my office in particular, is trying to help the research lab transfer into the commercial sector our technology. That could be in the form of intellectual property that we license. It could also be in the form of expertise that we lend to the private sector through a bevy of other kinds of agreements that we can create with the private sector. All of that geared toward helping us take our internal, sort of what I use as a metaphor, our inside the fence technology development activities, and try to transfer them into the commercial and private sector. I call that oftentimes, I use it, some people have heard me use it a lot, we're spinning out technology. We're also chartered though to look at the commercial sector and basically transition. That transition word means to us in my world, how do we transition commercial technology that might already exist or other innovation that is occurring, and how do we enable that to flow into the government, into the Department of the Air Force to serve the mission needs for the Air Force and for the Space Force. So spin in. And so in short, my office really does a lot of work in spin out and spin in. And in a lot of cases, we leverage, or we are enabling, perhaps is a better word, we're enabling the larger Department of the Air Force's SBIR and STTR process through the work that we do for spin in and spin out. But it's kind of shifting gears here a little bit. It's through this work, especially as we have engaged and interacted, my team and others that we work with, as we've interacted with the commercial sector, especially in what's happening in the space sector, the space economy, if you will. I've noticed over the last many years, and I think many of you have now noticed, that there's this really neat, I think, encouraging trend from our national standpoint, which is the growth of this commercial space economy. And it's a growth in a way that is maybe different than what a lot of people might expect. For the longest time, the space sector was dependent upon, and really still is to a large degree, the government. It was really expensive to essentially put objects, to put payloads into orbit. It was so expensive that it really was a matter of only nation states or just really large entities that could do this. And so for the longest time, the space sector has been more or less dominated by government funding and government interest. But we have now started to see that shift. And so part of the reason for that shift has to do mainly with this phenomenon. Over the last many years, the cost to launch objects into space has significantly decreased over time. This is really a revolution, I think, started by some of the billionaires that you know, SpaceX, even Virgin Galactic, the Virgin Group, from Amazon, right? We have Blue Origin, we have others, but really predominantly SpaceX, who created this whole new innovation on how to launch objects into space, mainly because in SpaceX's case, they were able to find a way and really innovate. And how do you reuse the launch vehicle in order to make it cheaper to launch anything into orbit? Because now you can reuse anything that you can reuse. It makes it a little bit cheaper. And just over time now, this model has driven down the cost for launching anything into orbit. A lot of folks in this world talk about launch costs per kilogram. So the chart here you see is just a trend that has been happening over several years, that we're now sort of in the sweet spot where we're below $1,000 per kilogram, and it seemingly is continuing to drop, making it much cheaper for anybody really to put payloads into orbit. And so what this has now generated is a whole new sort of engine in the private sector for how commercial entities, in particular, even startup entities, startup companies, are trying to get into this new market and really derive some kind of value, try to create some business model, a new business model that can derive value in space or from space. And so this has kind of beget a bunch of other trends that I'm going to show you right now. And apologies to those who've seen me talk about this before, but there's a growing now investment in this commercial space sector, a lot of investment in new companies, startup companies, other kinds of companies that have been created to take advantage of this low price point for launch costs in order to put more capability or different kinds of capability into space. And this chart is dated, I'll admit, but it's still showing an upward trend of investment that my understanding is still ongoing. Even now, even in a current investment cycle that may be a little bit flat in other sectors, there's still signs that investment is going up across the board for space technology and space interest. There's other indicators of this as well, the number of investors getting into the market. So not just the number of investment going into this commercial sector, but the number of investors, the types of investors is also going up, which is just another sign of how this commercial sector is growing. And then alongside the number of investors, obviously, the number of companies that are being invested in are all going up, right? Because of this cheap launch cost. So sort of the outcome that we're now starting to see is that this commercial space sector, one that's really not fully dependent upon the government, has grown tremendously compared to how it used to be. This was indication from, I believe, last year, Q3, but it's still the trend that we're seeing going forward is that this commercial space sector is really now dominating the space sector at large, where at one time it used to be mainly government civil, and government military that was dominating this economy. And then there's a lot of other indications you can find if you go look at what the Bryce folks are doing. They do a lot of analysis as to the sector, how to break down the sector into different components, and all of these components really are adding to this new space economy. Everything from what most people think of as launch, but everything from the actual satellites themselves in orbit to the ground equipment used to communicate with those satellites, the infrastructure that support the creation and fielding of these constellations now that are going up. All of that is growing across the board. And so a lot of times what I like to say is we're seeing so much growth in the space economy that I'm now starting to see large companies that would not normally be considered space companies, for instance, Caterpillar, GM, other companies that you might not have considered space companies in particular. We're seeing a lot of these kinds of companies getting into this new space sector. And so one of the taglines I like to promote, and I've had a lot of people with diverging opinions here, but I think it's a interesting tagline is, you know, at one time there was this idea that every company in the future was going to be considered sort of a software company, right? Software was eating the world. Everything had a software component to it. Any company typically had to be in the modern software space in order to thrive. And so I would like to suggest, based on these trends that we're seeing, that a lot of companies in the future, if not many, if not most, could probably be considered, you know, space companies to some degree, because they're going to be deriving value to some degree on this new space sector and space economy. So then one final point about how this market is growing and what's happening is, we're now starting to see these estimates pop up about how many satellites, how many objects will actually be in space, especially in low Earth orbit in the near future. Right now, we currently have between, I would say, 11,000, maybe higher than that, 15,000 or so, probably higher than that. But in the tens and 20s of thousands of satellites in orbit. But the estimate is that this is going to go up to way bigger, 100,000 satellites, if not more. This is, I've been told many times, this 100,000 satellites in orbit is a very conservative estimate. So that's great from an economic standpoint. I think for the way the space sector is growing and the capabilities, the value chains that will be created. But I will say this is also one of the trends that the Space Force, that the DoD is also watching, and also one that we have to contend with from a national security reason. One final metric here, I think, is that the actual investment, the actual value, economic value that some economists are talking about, is that we're going to get into the $1 trillion market space by 2030. Some say as high as $4 trillion, and that's a big old economy, in my opinion. That's a lot of value being created, perhaps wealth being created within this new sector. So kind of the takeaway here for you is launch costs have gone down, estimated number of satellites have gone way up, and the growth of the industry is going to be in the $4 trillion market or more by 2030. Now, from the Space Force perspective and from the US kind of national security space element for the federal government, this is really encouraging for the US, but it's also of a little bit concern too. And the two main things that you hear Space Force leaders and other national security space leaders talk about is that growing industry base means that we have to be, especially from the government standpoint, good stewards of that space domain. It's going to get really congested in that domain. And so part of what the Space Force is doing is trying to make sure that we're creating capability that can deal with that congestion. And part of what the Space Force is also wanting to do is make sure that that domain is protected, so that this commercial sector, this kind of private commercial sector, is enabled to grow unfettered as much as possible without any undue, outside threat, if you will, to the domain. So we're worried about a little bit about the congestion, and working on that, as also as how it might be contested. So now that space capability is a little bit more open to other, on the international sphere, entities around the world, whether that's a nation state or just private entities. Part of what the Space Force is doing is to make sure that the assets that we use from a national security standpoint, the assets that we use to enable the US national security apparatus, that those remain intact despite that congestion and despite what might be contestation going forward. And so with that reason, our program in New Mexico has been looking at a few ways that we do spin and spin out. Just a quick factor for the New Mexico element of AFRL and for the Space Force. There are 3 components of the Space Force currently at Kirtland Air Force Base. Obviously, we here in the research lab make up some of that. We have about 400 plus personnel, maybe 600 contractors that are at the Air Force Research Lab, supporting or a part of the Space Force, including myself. We have 2 other elements of the Space Force here in our backyard. One's called Space Systems Command. They do a lot of the, they're chartered to kind of do the procurement and major acquisitions of systems that the Space Force will use. And then a Space Rapid Capabilities Office is also here, headquartered here. They do a lot of the really quick turnaround kinds of capability development that's needed by, more immediate or needed for more immediate threats that are coming down the pipeline. From my perspective in our office, we run a number of programs that then enable us to do that spin-in capability. Really looking at how do we scout technology in the commercial sector, especially all this growing innovation that we're seeing, and try to determine in addition to a market fit. A lot of these commercial companies are trying to find a market fit. If you're a small company, you're trying to get your product or service fit to the market so that you can grow. What we've been doing in our programs through, for instance, the Space Force Accelerator program, is trying to understand, can we find not only help the companies find a market fit, but understand, is there a mission fit? Maybe a subset of government market that could be an outflow or a supporting servicing mechanism for these companies creating new innovative technology. The two accelerators that we run are the Catalyst Accelerator that you see here, the Catalyst Space Accelerator in Colorado Springs, and the Hyperspace Challenge that we run here in Albuquerque. And these accelerators very much look like, they smell like, feel like maybe a private sector venture capitalist-backed accelerator seen in the wild, but they're really more on helping companies find and catalyze that match between their commercial solution and a particular defense need. And what we've now seen going forward, kind of fast forwarding to my work with SpaceWorks, these accelerators are really a feeder for what is the SBIR, SBIR, STTR pipeline, now more or less overseen by for the Air Force, the AFWorks group, and for the Space Force, the SpaceWorks group. We also run a bevy of other programs. One of them is through our off-base collaboration facility in Albuquerque, we call the Q Station. The Q Station is more or less our front door for the Air Force Research Lab here locally. It's located in Nob Hill if you've never been here to Albuquerque, but it enables us as the AFRL, and we also facilitate other government entities to use the space in order to facilitate these kind of private engagements, these collisions that would lead to then some real understanding of market and mission fit. And in some cases, this enables companies to understand how they might line up to go into the SBIR and STTR pipeline. There's other things that Q Station offers because of our partnerships with the city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico to enable companies to understand also how they might do work in the state, in the Southwest. This would also include our work with the Arrowhead Center, right? The Arrowhead Center supports us tremendously using some of the work already that they have pioneered for helping companies access SBIR and STTR. And we also consider it home to the Hyperspace Challenge, as well as a incubator accelerator hybrid that we call the Q Station Space Tech Program, which is a year-long program that we enable companies, perhaps they've come out of one of the accelerators, or perhaps we found them in another way, enable them to really find a footing within New Mexico and find a footing within the new space sector by providing them some wraparound services that can help them grow in the region. What I'm also kind of super proud about, and so I know many of you are online that are participating in this, so thank you so much for this. I'm glad to see that through some of the work we've done out of AFRL, it has engendered sort of this private sector work that's now formulated into the Space Valley Coalition. The Space Valley, including Arrowhead Center, including a bunch of the partners that we work with that you see here listed and others, have really worked hard, in my mind, to really catalyze and coalesce together this new space economy for the Southwest and for New Mexico. So I'm really encouraged to see that as sort of an outflow from the work that we've been doing at AFRL. Quickly, I don't have a lot of time to finish out, but I did want to talk about then how the work that I do through this Air Force Research Lab office really enabled us to stand up the SpaceWorks element of the Air Force, of the Department of Defense, or Department of the Air Force, which is all about really operating the Space Force's SBIR, STTR pipeline. You know, the mission is very similar to what I already showed you for our office, for the AFRL office, but basically trying to accelerate the agile and affordable capability that we are seeing in the commercial sector, in the commercial space sector, towards some of the needs within, within the Space Force offices. The SpaceWorks is divided into 3 basic business lines, is what I like to call them. And probably the business line that most audience members care about most is the ventures business line, which really is the SBIR, STTR pipeline. And so I'll just kind of touch on that pipeline if you haven't seen this already. The Air Force modified this a while back when they stood up AFWERX, and then when we stood up SpaceWorks a few years ago. Basically, SpaceWorks is a subordinate group to AFWERX, and what they do through this program is enable companies to come in through the pipeline, starting with phase 1. These phase 1s are short-term, short performance contracts that have a smaller dollar threshold, really to enable us to kind of, throw the net wide and capture as many companies as we can, have companies basically access this pipeline as easy as possible, lowering kind of that barrier to entry through this kind of phase 1 process. But that then leads us to the phase 2 process. And I'm not going to read everything from the slides, but the phase 2 enables companies then, if they've in the phase 1, what you're supposed to really be doing as a company is using that opportunity and that contract to really find a mission fit. As I stated for the accelerators, we using this as a mechanism to enable companies to also find a mission fit with funding that they then could use to show us when they apply for the phase 2. Phase 2 then is kind of that natural next step extension from phase 1. The idea, though, is that you have created some value that has gotten some traction with in particular, a Space Force or Air Force program office or customer, that then shows us that there's some real traction here, and it allows you to enter into this longer term, higher dollar value phase 2 opportunity. And then you progress through the rest of this process, ending up hopefully positioned to go after these larger dollars in what I call post phase 2. There's a few options here, but I'm just going to go into the StratFi TACFi if you haven't seen this, just quickly to show you. This was created as a new element a while back to enable companies to not only enter into like this post phase 2 relationship with the government, but also enable the government and the private sector to invest together into the capability in order to provide more bang for your buck as a company, but for us also to provide some better value by matching to potentially private sector funding. So there's a few matching arrangements that you see here, and the matching basically means we take small business dollars that come through SBIR, and SpaceWorks is chartered with making sure those dollars are executed through the contracts, right, through the proposals. But what we're expecting from companies is that they're also bringing to bear a government customer in some cases, or a government customer and a private sector investor to enable them to grow that business pipeline. But SpaceWorks, that's their main charter to do all that work. Cognizant of time, I'm just going to skip right to the end. If you haven't heard of AFWERX SpaceWorks and you need to enter into this pipeline, probably your fastest way is to go to these websites and look at the opportunities that they post there, which includes a bunch of webinars and other things to help companies walk through the process. Some pretty detailed instruction on how to do that. And of course, you always have the Arrowhead team here as well to help you out. So I think I'll leave with that. I'm over time just a little bit, but that concludes my discussion for this morning, my keynote. Appreciate the time. Appreciate Arrowhead, Dana, and the team for having me here. And I think many of you know how to contact me. Otherwise, the folks can get to me if you ever have any questions. Thank you.
Steve. And we had a couple questions that I'll send to you, maybe if you want to reach out to them after.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much. And if everybody wants to go ahead and close this webinar and go over to the next session, it is funding your innovation, and that panel will get kicked off here in just a minute. Thank you.